I'd like to take a moment and give you some background on the poems for this week. So let me formally welcome you to week 1, where we're going to look at some contemporary poetry that represents gender roles. And so if I go into the module for week 1, I will see all of our readings as well as some recordings of the writers reading their own work. So by now, you should have read all of the poems in this module. If you have not yet done so, go read them closely and then begin this lecture. The first poem I'd like to look at is one that represents a father and a relation to a father figure, and that is Seamus Heaney's poem, Digging. After that, we'll look at Sylvia Plath's poem, Daddy, and her representation of the father there is very different, as is her relation with the patriarchy. Now, by patriarchy, I mean the social system where males hold authority in the family and wealth and heritage are passed down the male line. Now, while Seamus Heaney saw himself as continuing in this male lineage, in this tradition of digging, which we'll see in a moment, Sylvia Plath is resisting what she sees as an authoritarian rule. Looking at the giant figure in her poem Colossus, we can then see another image of Plath negotiating with an image of fatherly authority. So first I'm going to go to Digging by Seamus Heaney. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. So this begins with a poem about holding a pen, and it's very much like a gun. These two symbols are later described as symbols of his father. He remembers his father digging, and we have a description of him digging in a potato field. At the end of this description, we have this phrase, "By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man." And so we're looking at a lineage here, a lineage of fathers, and how this practice of digging and handling a spade, handling this tool, and being skillful at using this tool, is something that's passed down from father to son and father to son again. So Seamus Heaney sees himself as part of a line of men who dig, right? Because remember at the very end of the poem, he says, "The squat pen rests, I'll dig with it." But then later, after this first mention of a male lineage, he talks about his grandfather digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. And so inside of him, this lineage exists, and he's thinking of it. But he says, "I've no spade to follow men like them." He is following in his father's footsteps. However, he doesn't have a spade. He's continuing this tradition with his pen, and he's digging with his pen. His pen is like a transformation or a continuation of the spades of his forefathers. So the father figure here is someone the poet wants to emulate. He sees himself as a reflection of his father, digging with his pen. So now, let's turn to a very different perspective on a father figure, and a poet who imagines herself in a different kind of relationship with fatherly authority. Now that's Daddy by Sylvia Plath. Let me click on this poem. Now the first thing I want to mention is the sound qualities of this poem. And in this very first stanza, we see this repeated ooh sound that continues throughout. You do not do any more, black shoe. in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or achoo. This ooh sound makes this poem sound very haunting. And once you finish reading the whole poem, you see that Daddy is a shockingly intimate confession of a daughter struggling under the weight of an overbearing father. She says in the second stanza, "Daddy, I have had to kill you." And there's a description of him being giant, big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic where it pours bean green over blue in the waters off beautiful Nauset. I used to pray to recover you. And by recover, I think she means, like a shipwreck, something she could dig up and discover. However, later this relationship is described in terms of the genocide of the Jewish people by Nazi Germany. She refers to her father as being German and emulating Hitler, where she is often described in the position of a Jew. Now, unlike Seamus Heaney, who sees himself as a reflection of his father, the father figure in Plath's poem is frightening. "I thought every German was you," she says. "I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew." And right here, "I have always been scared of you, with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygoo, and your neat mustache, and your Aryan eye, bright blue." Plath then describes how her romantic relationships are also with men who reflect her father, and who are described as tyrannical as this father figure. She writes here, "Every woman adores a fascist. The boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you." At 20, she later writes, "I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do. But they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you. A man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw. And I said, I do. The rack and the screw refers to a torture device. So this is an abusive figure. Mein Kampf is the name of Adolf Hitler's book that made him, famous, if you could say that, notorious. And so she finds a man who imitates, who is just like her father. She says, "I made a model of you." And I said, "I do." Meaning she married him. So her husband is also a continuation of her father. But her relationship with this patriarchal line is very contentious, to say the least. She depicts them as abusive, overpowering, genocidal, and herself as the victim. In the end, she kills this father figure who she imagines as a vampire imitating her father. So we have a description of this killing. In the end here, she says, "If I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you." So here the father figure is depicted as a monster who terrorizes the village, and then the villagers finally get the chance to come back and kill him. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, Daddy, you bastard, I'm through. This last line is a powerful ending, and I think it is very significant that she called her father a bastard. A bastard is someone who does not have a father, or does not have a legitimate father. So think, while Seamus Heaney is imagining himself as part of a line of fathers, of legitimate fathers that recognize their sons as their sons, Plath here is disrupting this patriarchal line. And in what I consider a kind of act of rebellion against this authority, this apparently tyrannical, abusive authority. This can be a kind of rallying cry, I think, against the male abuse of authority. You bastard, I'm through. Meaning she doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the patriarchal line and the legitimacy of the patriarchal authority. Now, I want to turn to another poem by Sylvia Plath called The Colossus. In The Colossus, we have a description of the poet as this tiny little being living around this gigantic structure. And this can also show an aspect of this intimidating male authority. She imagines herself as an ant crawling across a giant human figure. She says, I'm skipping ahead to the middle of the poem, scaling little ladders with glue pots and pails of Lysol, I crawl like an ant in mourning over the weedy acres of your brow, to mend the immense skull plates and clear the bald white tumuli of your eyes. She is a tiny little thing crawling over this other gigantic human or structure, and she's using the pronoun you. So whoever she is speaking to is this giant. Remember, she used the word you in her poem Daddy. That's one of the ooh sounds that is repeated throughout. I think this giant figure is an image of patriarchal authority, which for Plath is an overpowering entity with a long history to hold it up. Notice what she says earlier. Perhaps you consider yourself an oracle, mouthpiece of the dead, or of some god or other. And then later, she writes, "Oh, Father, all by yourself, you are pithy and historical as the Roman Forum." And then another reference to his gigantic stature and what I think implies his self-importance is this line here. The sun rises under the pillar of your tongue. That places this figure's tongue in a very privileged spot. The sun rises underneath of it, meaning this tongue is above the horizon. It's that big. The tongue is also a reference to speech. And so what this giant figure says is more important or larger and more powerful than the horizon where the sun rises. In the end, Plath finds herself on the blank stones of a landing, hiding in shadows. She writes, "My hours are married to shadow. No longer do I listen for the scrape of a keel on the blank stones of the landing." Now, this means no longer does she listen for the sound of a boat coming up to shore. The keel is the bottom kind of seam of a boat, and you would hear that scrape if the boat is being taken up to a shore. So, on this gigantic structure of the Colossus. Plath, the image of the poet here, is utterly alone, cowering in its shadow. So I'd like to know what you think this giant represents in the poem. This is something to address in your week 1 discussion board post. So if I look over at the end of our module here, week 1 discussion board, in this discussion board, compare the representations of fathers in Seamus Heaney's poem Digging and Sylvia Plath's poems Daddy and Colossus. Heaney's father is a role model, while Plath's father figure is a tyrant. How does this demonstrate their different relationship to a patriarchal social structure? Now think about that and stay tuned, because I'll be posting another lecture on Jamaica Kincaid and that second poem by Seamus Heaney, Punishment. Stay tuned.